معلش معلش.
Uh, all right, so hi again, everyone. I really hope you enjoyed the first talk. So now we'll be moving to the second talk entitled "Elevate Your Defense Game." It will be animated by Nasreddine Bencherchali. He's a detection engineer and a threat researcher at Nextron Systems. Don't hesitate to ask your questions; they will be taken into account and answered at the end of the talk. You can go ahead, Nasreddine.
All right. Okay, thank you for this awesome presentation, or introduction, should I say. Welcome everyone to whoever is watching to my talk titled Elevate Your Defense Game. I will start with a small section about me. My name, as stated, is Nasreddine Bencherchali. I am a threat researcher at Nextron System, where we do all kind of detection stuff. I have a Medium blog that I write about detection and some other cool stuff, I think. You can follow me at Twitter at NasBench, if Twitter is still alive. And I've written some open source projects that you can find on GitHub related to detection engineering and threat hunting. So we will start by talking the agenda of today. I will start talking about a defense landscape overview. Then we'll pass on to something I call a transition, and we'll ask the question, how was the transition? Then we'll talk about our first strategy, part one of strategies to elevate your defense game. Then we're gonna understand the product, and I'll talk about what I mean by product later in the talk. Then we will tackle the second part of this strategies, which is strategies part two. I'll share some quick resources and I'll finish by accepting any questions. And please, this is an open discussion. I don't consider it as a talk. So if you have any important questions or you feel that the presentation is going too fast, you can stop me anytime. And I'm sure our presenter or our backend engineers will help me answer, tell me the question. So the first part is the defense landscape overview. Usually, when we talk about defense landscape, we think of three parameters of defense, which are network, applications, and endpoints. For the sake of brevity and to stay focused, I'm going to focus on the endpoint part for this presentation. Another point I want to mention is this is not a technical talk per se, but instead it's more of a mindset talk. And by that, I mean that it is more targeted at people who are experienced security engineers who are facing some issues inside their companies. So it's targeting the mindset rather than being technical. Of course, there will be some technicality along the way. So let's get started. Endpoint defense in the old days, or we call traditional defense of the endpoint, is basically managed by what we call an antivirus. So everyone, I think, is familiar with an antivirus software. And an antivirus software is basically a couple of engines stitched together to help you defend against threats on the endpoint. Back in the day, the engine was started with rudimentary like technologies such as signatures and IOCs, which are indicators of compromise. So everything related to hashes and identifying some string inside of the binaries, suspicious binaries, those are signatures. And of course, some firewall technologies. Then a couple of years later, some more nuanced and advanced technologies, one could say, were introduced, such as sandboxing and heuristics engines, which offered some intelligence to the antivirus software, but as you can see, not really. So the next evolution of the endpoint defense system is what we call the endpoint detection and response, which is the natural evolution because threat actors and attackers evolved and became more interactive and proactive in the attack. So we needed a response part, and that's what the EDR detection and response part comes. So in the old days, the antivirus companies were the one doing the works. And now with the EDR, they opened up a little bit. So we have more advanced features such as accessible telemetry and something we call incidents and playbooks. And of course, the response is in the name. So at least there are some response capabilities for some EDRs. And there is this aspect, what we call TTPs, or tactics, techniques, and procedures, which they offer detections for these TTPs and a bunch of more features depending on the EDR that you choose. So back in the day, the expectation of someone who manages this antivirus wasn't like quite big. There wasn't much expected from the administrator. It was basically a signature triggering, and you get an alert. And if you don't get an alert, then everything is fine. So if an alert triggered, then something bad happened. If nothing happened, then everything is supposed to be okay. With the introduction of this new technology that we call EDR, expectations have risen a little bit. So now the administration is a little bit more involved, as we say, and the operator or the user of this EDR needs to be familiar with the inner workings of the technology. Since threat actors have evolved, the knowledge necessary to block them or to mitigate against the threats is quite advanced. So they need knowledge of what is a TTP, what are the latest attacks, and a bunch more stuff. So one would expect that this transition would go smoothly, like a natural evolution of things. But unfortunately, this transition never really happened that smoothly. And we currently have a security engineers or guys at companies that are still treating EDRs as traditional antivirus software, meaning that they are expecting them to work out of the box. In the old days, you download an antivirus. Even today, most people will download an antivirus and it's done. You don't need to configure a lot of things. It will detect on its own. That is the logic that most people have. And unfortunately, security engineers inside companies have this idea still. And as I said, no tuning. By tuning, what I mean is you don't need to configure stuff to customize it. People expect that you install it and it works like a magical thing. But unfortunately, it's not the case. You need a lot of tuning to make the EDR work. And of course, with every technology that is a bit complex, you need the skill set necessary to operate it. Once again, the skill level didn't really elevate with the changing times. So with the introductions of red teaming and threat actors using more and more stuff and more advanced techniques, the skill level is really demanding nowadays. And there is a skill gap between the idea of how a traditional antivirus work and how the EDR work. So as I said, traditional antivirus didn't require the operator to know a lot of things, but now the EDR operator finds itself having to have deeper knowledge of operating systems. For example, Windows, how Windows works, the inner workings of a process, the threads, what is a driver, etc. What are TTPs that I've been mentioning from the start? What is a tactic, what is a technique, and what is a procedure? You need to be also considerate of false positives, and sometimes even have malware analysis skills. So it went from having practically no skills, just being able to click some buttons, to have a knowledge gap and a lot of things that you need to take into consideration. And another aspect that came with this transition is that back in the day, when you went to a company, the security team that managed the antivirus isn't big enough, or let's say it isn't big. Like you find 3 to 5 guys maximum who are managing tens of thousands of endpoints. But now, with the introduction of EDR, where you write your own detections and you need to react to incidents and you need to respond to them, it's a little bit more involved. So managing thousands of endpoints by a team of 2 isn't really a good way to go. And of course, the mentality of acquiring solutions, and these solutions, when you read about them, there are these magical boxes. Just buy a firewall and you'll be done. Just buy an antivirus and you'll be safe. Created this disparity of acquiring solutions without hiring the correct people. And let's not forget, evolutions of a product make it a little bit complicated. So I will touch on that aspect as well. So let me illustrate what I just said by a small example. So everyone, I hope, is familiar with Mimikatz, which is a credential dumping tool and other stuff. So a typical noob threat actor would go to the GitHub page of Mimikatz and download, as we call, the vanilla version of Mimikatz, meaning that just download it and execute it. The traditional way of thinking is the antivirus will trigger on it. And you'd be correct, because the part that triggers on this is what we call a signature or an IOC, because the vanilla version of Mimikatz it's known. It's been sigged, as we say, and it's been the hash is known. So a simple antivirus vendor could take this hash value, insert it into the database, and it will show an alert. And everyone is familiar with the alert on the right, or at least on your left. So, but if now we go to the next step, this is just an example of an interface from an EDR, or a CM, should say. It's Azure Sentinel. The first thing that you would notice that the interface has a lot of things going on, a lot of colors and a lot of text. So just out of the gate, it seems a little bit more involved. And you can see right now, you have something that we have discussed, which is the incidents, which instead of having, for example, as we've said, the alert on the right, which are malware detected, now you could not see this alert, but inside your EDR, you would see these kind of incidents. And these kind of incidents, as you can see, they have a description and they have a severity and they have logs related to each other, etc., etc. So it seems a little bit more complex, and it is. And this is just an example from Microsoft, but if you take other vendors such as CrowdStrike, Symantec, and whatever, they all offer up similar solutions with different interfaces, but the gist of the idea is the same. Complexity have evolved, and it's becoming more difficult. So, sum things up, I could say that there are two main factors that are playing against our defense game. So if you are a defender, on the endpoint at least, there are two main factors. There is the human factor that we've talked about in the start, which is humans are an important part of the chain. After all, you are recruiting engineers, and the engineers are the one who are operating your tools. So they are a really important part that we should focus on. And the mindset and the skill set needs to evolve because it is more important than ever. In the old days, the administrator wasn't involved and the tools were the best part of the things. But now we need to drop this mentality and work with the tools hand in hand and use the tool in our advantage to make the best out of them. And of course, there is another aspect, which is the product factor, meaning that you need to understand that the product is not as easy as it was, and you need to take time and understand the product. And it is one of the key things to elevate a defensive game inside of a security team. So I want to tackle the first part, which is strategies to elevate, which are just simple tips and tricks that will help you elevate your defensive game from a human perspective. So the first part is hire people. Don't expect to defend against or control thousands and thousands of endpoints in larger companies with just a small team or just 2 members and expecting them to do magic. People are important and you should hire them. Another part is you should stop treating it as a magical software, meaning that it needs tuning and the human intervention to work as it should. So a typical process would be to recruit a human, and the human would operate the EDR in the best case scenario. The skill set, the human that you recruit or the engineers that you recruit needs to have the necessary skill set to do their job. And you can simply elevate your skill set by doing a lot of things, which are really basic things, but really important, especially in the security field. Read more books and blogs. There is a lot of free information out there. I could name a few blogs out there that, especially in the defensive side, that are really helpful. And I will recommend some books by the end, but I think books are really important and you should read them. Social media is also an important part. We love it or hate it. Twitter is an important part of the information security field. So you should follow the right people. Request specialized training from your company. And I've put multiple stars in this section because sometimes companies recruit people and expect them to do magic. Of course, you are expected to do the amount of work and sometimes more, but it is really important to have the necessary training. And I really highly suggest that companies start like doing basic training, like for Windows internals, and what is malware analysis, just to level up the game of the whole team and the engineers. Learn to love Windows and understand it. What I mean by that is that even there are operating systems, and most of us use Linux in the real world when we develop stuff and whatever, but Windows is the most targeted operating system out there. So people should really learn to love it and love to understand it, because if you understand it well, you'll be able to easily understand how attackers are leveraging its functionality, and you could then defend against it. Of course, another point is familiarize yourself with offense. By that, I mean, don't you sit there and expect detections to come out of the sky. You need to get your hands dirty, as we say, and test the attacks. What is Kerberoasting? What is dumping credential? What is lateral movement? If you heard a tool called Impacket, what is Impacket? Download it, use it, create detections for it. Believe me, or trust me, when you apply these kind of small steps, the whole defensive or human aspect of the security team will start to elevate. And finally, which is an important part, because we are using these tools, we should be required, at least to some extent, to understand these internal of this product. So next section is about just that, understanding the product. So EDRs are a complex piece of software. They contain multiple components that are working behind the scenes. They have collectors that collect the telemetry, they have incident engines, they have heuristic engines, they have signatures, they have a lot of building blocks that works interchangeably between each other to be able to show you the events and the generated telemetry. So getting familiar with these components is really key to advancing your level to the next step, because once the human part is worked on, you've recruited the best engineers out there. But at the end of the day, your interface to the defensive side, or your interface to the attackers, is your tooling, because you cannot write tools from scratch every time you want to do something. The tools are here to make our lives easier. So the better you understand them, the more results you will get. So understanding the telemetry that is being generated. So for by telemetry, of course, I mean the logs. So if a process is being created, you will get a log in the interface. If something downloads a driver or downloads a malicious software, you will get these events. You need to understand that these events are important, and what do they represent? What is a process creation event? How it is happening behind the scene? The second important aspect is what can your EDR do and what it cannot do. As I've said before, don't expect the EDR or the endpoint security system to be like a magical bullet. Like you put it in here and it suddenly like defend or mitigate against all threats. Every EDR out there, no matter how many times the PR people like to brag about the EDR, have their flaws and have their advantages, no matter the company. So it's better to know the advantages and know what you can't do and fill those gaps. Okay, much more than that, but I think these are two most important aspects. And I want to illustrate this with a small schema. So a typical discussion when you're here with an EDR or when you are interacting with an EDR is that you would say, or you will see, that the EDR detected X, and X here is a threat. Let's say Mimikatz. Okay, so EDR detects X, and the lines below are what we call the sources of telemetry, or the sources that the detection is based on. So you could receive command line, or you could receive something from ETW, which is event tracing for Windows, or you could get something from the Windows API and other stuff. Of course, having this or asking this specific question is what takes your detection to the next level. So in the case of Mimikatz, let's say you should ask the following question. So how is my EDR detecting the following threat? Are they detecting it by hash, meaning that I downloaded Mimikatz from the website and it's blocked? So is it blocked by hash? How could I test this? I will change something inside the binary, which intrinsically means that the hash change, and I will drop it again on the system. Is it detected? Is it not? I will type something in the command line. I will say mimikatz and do something. So if the detection is based on the command line, what happens if I change those command lines? What if I recompile this? And is it leveraging a source such as ETW? What happens if I patch this source? Like, is it using the Windows API? What happens if I use syscall? Is it using native API? Is it using kernel 32? Or is it using something completely different? Okay, so these kind of questions are really important to ask. And this is what makes the difference between a good team and an excellent team at defense. So this brings me to the final point of strategies, which is the product factor. These may seem like simple strategies to you, but understanding the inner workings of your EDR, as I said, will level up your game by a big margin. Having this knowledge, like of how your Symantec product work, how your Microsoft product work, how CrowdStrike work. Even sometimes it's hard. I'm not talking about reverse engineering the EDR in itself, but just asking the right question and doing the right tests. Just the example I gave before, changing the command line and blocking a source, blocking the event log, stopping the source from the event log. Is it getting from the event log? Is it getting it from the Windows API? Those kinds of questions. And the key to building robust detections require knowledge of the internals and knowledge of what the EDR can and cannot do. So if I know that the EDR is using only command line in its own detections, and on the other hand, it offers detection based on the Windows API. Me, as a security engineer, what I say, okay, I have detection for command line parts, but if an attacker switches those command lines, I will be blind, and I don't like that. So what I do is leverage the other telemetry that I discovered, it is collected by my IDR, and build robust detection. And this process is what makes a good detection engineering team or a good security team elevate their game on the defensive side. Once again, don't take things at face value. Ask the right question. By that I mean, you will see a headline on a blog post on a vendor. See, vendor X says, I detect mimikatz, I detect process injection, I detect process hollowing, whatever. So one of the most important questions is, my EDR is detecting the implementation of a technique or a technique itself. What I mean by that, is it taking stuff at face value? Is it downloading mimikatz, analyzing a little bit of it, and then writing detection? And me, since I don't know how it works, I will be tricked. I will say, oh, it detects stuff, so I think it's good to go. It's the best thing out there. But in reality, it's not. And by the way, that's why you read in a lot of blogs that a company was hacked. But if you looked at the report, you would see that the attacker actually used basic stuff, PSExec, mimikatz, some random tool that was created 15 years ago, and it still works. And there is some truth to that and some issues that I will not delve into today, but the biggest factor that you could add to your security team is delving deep and understanding the process, how it works. Okay, so a couple of resources before I finish this. I highly suggest, if you take anything away from this talk, I highly suggest you would drop by the SpectreOps blog and read a blog series, which I believe has 7 parts as of now, and it's a continuing series called On Detection, which is really interesting, and it really delves deep into the concept that I'm talking about right here, that I've just touched upon, but this blog post goes more in depth. Another blog post by SpectreOps is called Capability Abstraction by Jared Atkinson and teams at SpectreOps. This blog showcases this idea of abstraction and how the layers hide stuff from you. So we've talked about command line, what is below the command line, what is below that, and etc. A couple of books that you should read, I think, are the Windows internal books, are a must-have. There is an interesting book, since we've been talking about antivirus software. It's called Antivirus Bypass Technique. It showcased some of the things that I talked about today and a couple of more, especially some attacks such as process injections and different implementation techniques. And there is a book called Adversarial Tradecraft in Cybersecurity, which also talks about some offensive side and defensive side. I highly suggest that you read that. Now, if you want to see detections in play and benefit from open source detection, one of the projects that we maintain at Nextron is the Sigma project, which contains thousands of detections available for free for you to use. It's an open source project. You can contribute and you can use those tools, those rules. So feel free to do that. And if I didn't emphasize this enough, play with red team tools. There is a big debate going on Twitter, but the most important thing is that you need to understand how attackers think sometimes to be able to mitigate against that, or to at least gain the idea necessary to implement some defensive mechanisms. Okay? And I believe that's it. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this small and quick talk. You can follow me on Twitter, and you can read my blog at nasbench.medium.com. And if you have any questions, I'll gladly answer all of them, if I can. Thanks.
So thank you so much, Nasreddine, for this amazing talk. It really was great. And now, if you don't mind, we'll be moving to the Q&A section. So if you have any question, just feel free to ask. Nasreddine is open to all the questions.
Don't be shy. Ask your questions.
They're all saying that the talk was great and fruitful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
And indeed, it really was.
I know that there are some topics that I've glanced upon, by the way, which are really in-depth topics. This is just a small presentation, but I highly suggest to our listeners who are interested in defense to take a look at some of the things that I've mentioned, especially the blogs, and especially what we call ETW and what is it telemetry. Especially these concepts are really important. I think if you take anything, go Google these keywords. Just type in Google ETW detection engineering and go ahead.
All right, so thank you so much, Nasreddine. I guess they have no questions.
No worries.
It really was an honor for us to have you here among us. And thanks for the great.
Mine. Yeah, thank you for letting me present, and we will meet again on the cyber world.
Hope so.
Yeah. Cheers.